All right. Greetings, everybody. I'm Larry Williams, the director of the Consortium for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, and we really couldn't be more excited than we are to be welcoming you here for our kickoff lecture, part of the CARMA Webcast program. And the first event of the day is our Meet the Methodologist interview, which we've decided to bring to you live via the webcast stream. And so we're glad that you can join us. We're here with my longtime dear friend, Jeff Edwards. I'll have more to say about him when I introduce him for the webcast. We only have about 20 minutes, so we're going to get right with it. Dude.
Bro.
Do recent methodological developments leave us better prepared to test and find mediation or moderation?
Or both, right? Possibly? Okay. I think that they're kind of divergent paths, so to speak, in the sense that so methods for testing mediation, and part of what I'll be talking about later today is that there's a lot of excitement about mediation, particularly post-Barron and Kenny, working with a 3-variable model as the prototype, and those of us who've written about the topic often use that model as a point of departure, which is a very simple model and far simpler than most researchers would bother to test. Mediation, as we've learned about it and currently discussed, is a special case of path analysis, and so I think we would all be collectively better off if we went back to the basics on path analysis, and which would then we would see that the practice methodology and practice in mediation is a simplified version of a methodology that was historically was worked out in much more thorough detail than we see now. So the methodological developments for mediation, I think, would be well informed by returning to some of the roots of path analysis. And that, I think, path analysis lost its panache when structural equation modeling came along. It was like the poor man's SEM, so you're not hip and with it if you're still doing path analysis. And yet, the relationships among the latent variables in a structural equation model, that is a path model. And much of the understanding about how to derive direct, indirect, total effects and understand what spurious relationships are and what unanalyzed components of correlations are, that all applies in full force to structural equation models, the vast majority of those that we concern ourselves with. For moderation, I think that the developments, and this would apply for mediation as well, is taking into account ways to address the assumptions in these models, particularly the ones having to do with measurement error. We can readily go to a latent variable, a mediated model that is a latent variable model in SEM and address measurement error, but the ways of handling measurement error with moderated models has proven pretty elusive. The underlying mathematics can get pretty complicated. It has to do with the measurement model is where the complications come in, and I've worked those through myself, and I'll just tell you, it's nothing for the faint of heart. There are procedures now, particularly in M+ that have built in a approach for handling moderation that takes measurement error into account, and in fact there are no product terms involved. I won't go into the details of it here, but it's important to know that by making that approach, the approach easy, user friendly, it can shield us from what's actually going on behind the scenes in terms of the assumptions that are being made and the particular method that's involved. So there are advancements in handling measurement error with moderated models, but I think it's important for us to grapple with the roots of all of this, the assumptions that are being made with that particular approach, what some of the other alternatives are as well. But usability is a big issue here. From a technical standpoint, there are solutions in hand, but applying them is another matter entirely.
So is it, are we equally prepared? Or are we better prepared for one or the other?
We're better prepared for, well, we can kind of go old school and make a lot of advancements in mediation, I think. For moderation, if we're going to, there's a specification of the models, but then if we're going to take measurement error into account, I think that is, technically we're prepared. From an application standpoint, we're not all that prepared. If you try to specify these models yourself, get ready for a tedious haul and opportunity to make lots of mistakes.
All righty. All right, so question 2. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Is understanding mediation or moderation more important for theory development? Is understanding mediation or moderation more important for theory development?
You mean is understanding mediation or moderation more important for theory development?
Yes.
That's the question. Okay, all right. I think that they answer different kinds of questions. A mediation question is answering the question of why or how do two variables relate to one another. What's the underlying mechanism or a process that's responsible for a relationship? So when we think about a simple model that has like an X causing a Y, that arrow is trying to tell the story of what that arrow represents. Why it's the why question from a theory development standpoint that goes into giving a compelling reasons why that relationship would be there of a particular sign and hopefully of a particular magnitude if we dare to go that far. To then formally test the explanation, we would often introduce a mediating variable that captures that explanation. But then, of course, we now, rather than one arrow, we have two arrows, and each of those arrows has its own explanation as well. That probably implies another mediator. So at some point, we lose our patience or our tolerance, and we stop putting mediators in for every explanation, and maybe take it as an article of faith as to what is responsible for the relationship. Cook and Campbell, in their '79 book, had a nice discussion of micromediation, which is basically taking the sort of infinite regress you can get into if you keep trying to explain what is responsible for an arrow and having that imply a mediator, then more arrows, more mediators. So the mediation helps to address the why question, which is often treated as the defining characteristic of good theory, answering why. Mediation allows us to put those kinds of explanations to the test and also offer perhaps competing explanations for the same relationship, which would be multiple mediators, and then comparing paths. Moderation is more of a whether or under what conditions a relationship would exist, or probably more appropriately would take on various signs and strengths in terms of the size of the path or the size of the slope. So variation in effects is what moderation is about. And at the most basic level, moderation addresses the boundary conditions of a theory, where we say that the theory, we mean to explain within a certain set of confines what a phenomenon is about, which means that the relationships we explain apply for some circumstances, but perhaps not for others. And those circumstances effectively become a kind of moderator variable or moderation set of circumstances. Within the model itself, a theoretical model, as we try to understand or probe the magnitudes of the relationships that we see, or when they might even switch sign, that's what moderation would help us to understand. I think that many of our theories they're pretty devoid of specificity, in the sense that we have theories of the type that if X goes up, Y goes up or down, and that's kind of the end of the story for most theoretical propositions. If we can get to the point where I think it'd be a worthwhile pursuit, where we can start to calibrate how large the relationships are and grapple with those kinds of explanations and predictions, then variation in those magnitudes, well, that's what moderation is about. And so we could formally bring in moderators that would help us to calibrate the magnitudes of relationships, as opposed to just saying the relationship gets stronger or weaker.
Hey, well, let me ask you this. So if you understand the mediator, you know why two things are related. If you don't understand that mediator, how can you begin to describe how that relationship will vary across the moderator? So doesn't that suggest that mediation is more important?
From a theory development standpoint, perhaps so, if you subscribe to the idea that being able to explain why a relationship exists is a defining characteristic of a theory. That's essentially a mediation type of statement. So perhaps and I agree with you that if we can't explain the mechanism, then it's really hard to say what would make that mechanism vary in magnitude. Almost any kind of hypothesis is about explanation for an arrow has effectively mediation language built into it, even if mediation is not tested. There may be even more than one explanation. So theory A, theory B, and theory C all sort of support that there should be this relationship between an X and a Y. The theories are giving the explanation, and the variables that capture what those theories are about may not be included. It's just really more of we make the argument and hope that it's compelling and stands on its own right. We're better off if there are, say, 3 explanations from 3 different theories, that we have variables that represent those theories, so we can begin to sort out whether in fact those explanations are there. Because there could be a 4th theory that could explain it just as well, but it just didn't happen to consider it.
Okay. Third question. Thanks for that. Allow me that little bonus, bonus question.
My methods comps are being repeated right here.
All right. So what are the most important aspects of testing for mediation and moderation that most researchers don't understand?
So for mediation, I think what's important, and again, this is what I'll be talking about a little bit later, is the fundamentals of how to cast mediation in terms of a path model, and what it means to trace through and decompose all of the many ways that a variable on one side of the model can relate to a variable on the other side of the model. And here I'm talking about primarily the indirect effects. There are ways, and this is something that one of the primary, it's a casualty of having discarded path analysis. It's the baby with the bathwater kind of thing, where out went path analysis and out went the mechanics and the algebra behind and the methodology of the tracing rule that Sewell Wright developed and was described in a 1934 article. So we can start with one variable and look at a variable causally downstream. There can be many ways to get there, and each of those is a separate indirect effect that it's important for us to understand how to formally identify all those indirect effects, how to take the path estimates to compute those indirect effects, and then form confidence intervals around them, how to compare them, subtract one from the other and see which one is bigger or smaller, add them all together and get a total effect. If you look at software, and I'll use Lisserl as an example here, Lisserl has an option for having it to estimate the effects for you. It's an EF statement in the output line if you're old school like me. And what that gives you is you'll see indirect effects and total effects come out in your output. Those indirect effects it's the sum of all of the indirect effects. It's not each indirect effect individually. And so for the applied researcher, it's still a mystery as to what is being added up to give you all of those indirect effects. But it's absolutely essential to be able to trace those out and derive those for yourself. Also, the test is you get a standard error, but an indirect effect is not likely to be normally distributed because it's a product of coefficients. And if the 2 coefficients themselves are normally distributed, you multiply them together, the product will not be. And so a corollary to understanding how to trace all the indirect effects and decompose those is that each of them, we need non-parametric techniques to be able to form confidence intervals around them. And that's going to be the bootstrap. And that's another methodology that's become automated in certain packages that I think we're all better off if we sort of look behind the curtain and have a better understanding of what is actually going on when the bootstrap is applied, so that we can master it and use it for our own purposes for the questions we want to address. Misunderstandings in moderation, I think, are probably fewer because we're pretty well accustomed to things like simple slopes and how to handle multiple moderators. I think we're pretty, that methodology is pretty well in hand. There is a literature that points to the value of having the 2 squared terms along with the product term in a moderated model, which is something I think we should consider. And not that I'm just a fan of quadratics, but because they're what we see as a moderation with the cross product term, the cross product term is often correlated with either of the squares. And so it's important to make sure that we're drawing conclusions that are in fact consistent with what the data actually would attempt to tell us. And then two together, trying to combine moderation and mediation, that's when things get a little bit dicey. But if you break it down into every moderation, every moderated path in a mediated model is essentially moderated regression in some form, then we can get our feet wet and start to move forward with those models.
All right. Question 4, what are some important directions for the development and application of methods for testing moderation and mediation?
So I think application is probably the bigger of the two. So for instance, the developments, and I'll use mediation, which is the way we see it is a special case of a path analysis. There's not, just benefiting from what has already been developed would be a big step forward from an application standpoint. So I think it's just, it's useful for us to be collectively schooled in what the fundamentals of path analysis are, so that we can better master the application of mediation. And I mean, do it yourself. Take a model, you develop the model, you determine how to estimate that model, you've determined how to find all the effects that are implied by the model, and then try to make sense of them. That's an application question. It's not so much a development question because the methods are there. And I'm not saying, please understand, I'm not saying that we should abandon SEM and go back to path analysis. I'm saying that the relationships among the latent variables, that is a type of path model. And what has been learned in path analysis applies to those kinds of models in terms of correlation decomposition and effect analysis. And there simply there's not much literature on that. There's a few articles here and there, but there's not much. So it's an application standpoint. I think that if we rely on our statistical tools and macros and so forth to conduct those kinds of analyses, that it can allow us to remain one step removed and not fully understand and really master what's involved. And that mastery is important. It's empowering. It enables us so that if you can imagine the research question, you can answer the research question and be self-sufficient in that regard. For the application of moderation, a direction for development, I think, again, is moving beyond regression to handle the measurement error involved in moderated tests of moderation. M+ is one package, again, that has a particular approach that's been built into it. But there are other approaches that it's just simply not very user-friendly. And so I think that making those approaches understood and allowing researchers to be able to apply them without making them too onerous. So be able to trace and understand the reasons why those models are specified the way they are, and have, again, some self-sufficiency and mastery in that area. It's just that it tends to be complicated because it's just the nature of the beast.
Thank you so much. I've got some great news. You did so well on those 4 questions that you get to the bonus round.
I do?
Yep. Each one's only 15 seconds.
Yeah?
First question, favorite rock band?
Depends on the era.
Dun, dun, dun.
Okay, all right. I've been heavily influenced by the Cars from back in the day, U2 as well. Of course, if you're a creature of my generation, you have to say Zeppelin and the Stones. That's fine, but it's a moving target. So there's a lot of good music out there. It's fun to play.
Favorite song?
Oh gosh. I don't really have a single favorite song. Any songs by those bands I just mentioned, I would tend to turn up the radio, or the whatever the sound source might be. Maybe not radio anymore.
All right, last question. You prefer to play the guitar or to sing?
Sing. No, I'm not saying I'm any good. I'm good at either one of them, but that's particularly when you have a forgiving audience. Usually that involves some kind of lubrication and a karaoke venue, or maybe in my attic where I have a sound system too.
Yep. The CARMA band. Jeff is a founding member of the CARMA band. So Jeff is here to do our kickoff lecture in 10 minutes. So we appreciate you joining us for the Q&A, the Meet the Methodologist interview. We're going to turn our mics off and get set up, and we'll be back at you in about 10 minutes.
Thanks to this guy for creating CARMA and serving the entire globe in terms of research methods education. There is no substitute on the planet for this human being right here. He's an absolute gem for all of us.
Thanks. Thank you. All right, we'll be back.
All right.